So we're so happy to have Dr. Girija Kaimal here with us tonight for this encore edition of Art and the Brain as part of the Dana Foundation Neuroscience and Society talk series. Girija Kaimal is an art therapist, mental health researcher, author, artist, teacher, and leader in her field. She is a professor at Drexel University in the Ph.D. program in Creative Arts Therapies and the assistant dean for the university's Division of Human Development and Health Administration. At Drexel, she directs the Health Arts Learning and Evaluation Lab, sometimes known as the HALE lab, where she studies how visual art making affects our physiological and psychological well-being. Some areas of her research include traumatic brain injury, PTSD, as well as chronic stress among cancer patients and their caregivers. These last couple of years have been very busy for Dr. Kaimal. Among other things, she served as the president of the American Art Therapy Association, maintained her own art practice in which she explores identity and the representation of emotion, and she's published a wonderful book called The Expressive Instinct: How Imagination and Creative Works Help Us Survive and Thrive. By the way, if you would like to get a copy of the book, there is a link to purchase The Expressive Instinct in the chat panel here on Zoom. Now, without further ado, please take it away, Dr. Girija Kaimal.
Thank you so much, Dorian and Margaret. Thank you for that great introduction. And thank you to the Secret Science Club and to the Dana Foundation. This is such a fun thing to do. And I really appreciate the creative and innovative ways in which you bring science and technology, and in this case, the intersection of the arts and the sciences to the community. So thank you for having me. And let me just now get my slides up. Can everybody hear me? Yes?
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
All right, so I'm going to do my slide share. Okay, and let's get my slideshow. All right, can everybody see the slides?
Yes, they look perfect.
Okay, okay, great. All right, so I'm really happy to be here, and I wish I could see everyone and I could interact with you in person like we did just a month ago. But I'm excited to connect here, and please sort of hang on to your questions, and we'll do a Q&A in the end. So to start a little bit about me, when I look at sort of my life trajectory, I'd like to think it was all like beautifully planned, but it really wasn't. And what I can say is that somehow the way I have worked and the way I work now brings together something that my high school counselor had told me many, many years ago. So when I couldn't figure out what I wanted to do in college, I went to her and I said, all right, I can't figure out. I really love everything. I enjoy the sciences. I enjoy the arts. I enjoy language. There's nothing that I really don't enjoy. What should I do with my life? And so she gave me the survey, and I landed right in the middle that, you should be doing something at the intersection of the arts and sciences. I was like, okay, great. That doesn't help. I knew that already. But I think this is where some of the artificial distinctions that we've made between disciplines really comes to play, and we need to pay attention to that. So to tell you a little bit about myself, I'm a lifelong artist. The role of the arts has changed over time for me. So initially, as a child, I used to draw and paint because I was pretty sickly, and I spent a lot of time away from school. And this was a way for me to process, to communicate, and share with those in my home what I did all day. And I went on to become, my first degree is in design. So I went on to become a professional designer. And what I found was that being a designer and making art my livelihood was not necessarily the way I wanted to sort of proceed. And a big part of my professional interests are in human functioning and human behavior. And so when I discovered the field of art therapy in the late 90s, I said, oh, wait, this brings together my interest in the arts and my interest in human functioning and human psychology. So I went ahead and got a degree in art therapy in the very program that I now chair. And again, not part of a life plan at all. It's fascinating how life evolves. And at that time, I worked with a lot of clinical populations, HIV, AIDS, children in alternative schools, inpatient psychiatric units. And what really excited me at that time was to do sort of more systematic research, because art therapy as a profession really began during World War II, when service members and soldiers struggled with what was then called shell shock. And it has evolved as a clinical field for over 70 years. But my interest really was, well, how do we know these things? So how can we better understand the role of arts in our life? Because the arts are as old as the hills, and I'll go into this in more detail. But how can we better understand the role of creative expression and the arts in our life? What is it that helps improve our quality of life when we engage in creative expression, artistic expression? So I went on to get a doctorate, and at that time, there were no doctoral programs in art therapy. So I got my doctorate in human development and psychology. And the image here in the middle really brings together what I think of as the intersection of the arts and the science in my life and my work right now, which is that the study and the studio kind of come together. So the very table that I'm talking to you from right now is my work table, is my art table, is my sort of work table with my laptop. And I see my artistic practice very much inspiring our scientific studies, and our scientific studies very much sort of connecting back and inspiring artistic practice, educational practice, mentorship, all of it. So that's sort of the gist of how I came to all of this. My roots are in India. I grew up mostly in India and Nepal, and now I've been in the US, I think, for as much time as I spent in India and Nepal growing up. So I kind of feel really defined by two different countries and two different cultures. And to me, these have really brought together and sort of had moments of survival, but also moments of thriving. And this is what I really want. I hope of everything that I shared today, that you walk away with this idea that we are inherently creative. And if you doubt it, I hope I change your mind through this talk. So welcome, and here we go. Let's see. Okay, so we've all heard this adage, right? Like when a plant does not survive or a seed does not grow, we change the environment around it. So most of our lives, I think most of our sort of needs are survival based, right? We need food, we need shelter, we need belonging, we need community, all of those things. But as humans, we sort of need more because of the way our brains are structured, because of our creative capacities. We need to thrive. And I share this example of this potted plant in my house, which was a fig plant that I got last summer, and it promptly died as soon as I got it home, or it looked like it had died, because it was in a corner that perhaps was not ideal for it. And I moved it to my room. I put it in the sun. I, gave it some fertilizer, water, and it just exploded with leaves within just a few weeks. And it's a reminder to me, like there's so many metaphors in nature. It's a reminder to me around how simple things, little things, and this applies to us as well, when we adjust little things in our lives, in our context, in our environment, that changes our sort of fundamental need to thrive. So sometimes it might just be a simple thing, moving a few feet, moving a little closer to the sun, south-facing window, that completely changes changes how we function. So I'll start first with some aspects of the human condition, right? There are some things which define us as humans and which are fairly universal to all of us. So number one is this idea of uncertainty. We can all look back. We can be in the present, of course. We understand the present. We are in this moment. We can understand, perhaps look back, reflect on the past. What we don't know is the future. We don't know what lies ahead. And this is a fundamental condition that is sort of shared by all humans, right? We might be able to predict, we might be able to prepare, but we really don't know what lies ahead. So a lot of the ways in which our brain is wired is to prepare for this uncertainty, is to prepare for what lies ahead. And if you think about the sort of fundamental function of our brain is to make sure you're alive moment to moment. So what our brains are doing is really predicting. Think of the brain not as a computer, but more as a predictive machine, which means that it is constantly scanning the environment and your memories to determine what needs to happen and how you need to prepare for the future. So perhaps in today's case, you had a calendar invite, you had it perhaps listed in your things that you might do today. Hey, today evening, I will go for this talk, which means I should have my phone or laptop charged. I should have Wi-Fi access. I should make time. These are ways in which we prepare. These are simple little things. We might prepare long term, we might prepare short term, or we might not prepare at all. So this idea around the future is actually something that anchors us in many ways. Okay, so I mentioned that we have predictive machines. So what, as our brain, so what does that mean really? It means that in some ways, when we use this predictive capacity in a meaningful way, in a useful way, we are practicing our imaginations. And we can't help ourselves. And this is where I will reiterate for the second time that we are inherently creative. Because we have predictive brains, we cannot help but imagine. We cannot help but create scenarios or imagine what can be. This is unique to us. This is not something that other mammals or other animals have in the abundant capacity that we have. Now, when this works really well, we have imagination, we have innovation, we have creative products. But when it doesn't work so well, it creates anxiety where we only imagine a negative future or we only imagine things going wrong in the future. Anxiety. Or we cannot imagine anything at all. We do not anticipate a future for ourselves. That's hopelessness and depression. So our brains are incredibly, incredibly sensitive and adaptive. And it's a lot. I mean, to the extent that we have control over our functioning, our thinking, our emotions, or exercise control, this can go either ways, okay? And I'll show you examples of how this works. All right. The third aspect of the human condition that is really important is that we are deeply, deeply emotional beings. Even those of you who think you're not emotional, you are deeply and profoundly emotional. We are not cognitive beings with some emotion. We are deeply emotional beings, some cognition going on. So the emotional part of our brain is actually more primitive and more powerful than the cognitive part of our brain. So anytime you are faced with a challenge or a threat, your cognitive control will be overridden by emotion, because emotion is what sort of guides that very deep survival instinct. And the images here again are showing you how I see the emotion piece of it either being harnessed in this case. So if you harness fire, think of fire as an analogy. If you harness it, you get candlelight, you get pottery, you get fuel to cook. However, if you let it burn uncontrolled, you get ash, you get forest fires, and you get destruction. That's not something we are aspiring for either. So much of our functioning is really fuel, really sort of really powerful forces that are in our hands, whether we harness it or not. Everybody with me still? Yes?
Yes, we're
Yes.
with you.
Okay, great. All right. So lastly, a lot of what I spoke about so far is the individual human, right? So we have these sort of survival instincts, choices, the way we think. But a big part of being human is that we are very, very wired to be connected to others. We are not isolated beings. And to be isolated is actually a threat signal to the brain, which means you're unprotected, you're unsafe, and you have no one to sort of have your back. So we are wired to be in a tribe, in a community, and have people, have allies to help us meet all these needs. And I sort of, I'm not a fan of Maslow's hierarchy of needs because I think our needs are very much more like a weave. They are interconnected. And very often when one need is not met, it's the other needs that can help hold the fabric of life and hold our sort of functioning together. So when we have a sense of love and belonging, perhaps our struggles with self-actualization are compensated. When we have security, jobs, health, perhaps some of the physiological challenges are offset. So I think very much of this need to belong and connection as inherent, intertwined, and profoundly part of who we are as humans. So I shared with you that imagination is very much uniquely human. Yes, we see examples of things made by animals. You've seen the weaver bird's nest. You've seen little things that animals do with their nests, with their child rearing, all those pieces. But most of those, I would argue, are instinctive behaviors. They are not creative behaviors. So you will not see a lot of sort of innovative variations of the weaver bird's nest, right? Because they are creating it purely for the purpose of raising their young. It is not a sort of soul-filling need to make a beautiful interior for that weaver bird's nest. What makes us unique as human beings is this desire to innovate, to problem solve, and to sort of pursue this idea of fulfillment and creative fulfillment. I do believe this is all connected to that idea of uncertainty, which fuels our imagination, keeps us innovative. Think about the adage again, necessity is the mother of invention, that something about this fundamental uncertainty is cueing us and is fueling our creative capacities. And I think of the connection between imagination and creative expression as one being more in the brain and in an intangible form, and then the creative workspace is when we convert our imaginings into something concrete. All right. So one of the exciting things that perhaps we knew intuitively, but we did not know as concretely, is this idea that psychological struggles have profound physiological manifestation. So, for example, loneliness, which signals isolation, not solitude. Solitude is a useful thing, it's a positive thing, but loneliness implies that nobody cares for you, you are on your own, and as I had mentioned before, that's a threat signal. These experiences can damage and create conditions in the body that are not different from when you get a bacterial infection or when you have like a physical illness. So some of the outcomes, for example, for loneliness are worse than conditions like diabetes and heart disease. Secondly, this idea that self-expression is essential for our health is becoming more and more evident. So our need to connect, our need to express ourselves is deep and profound. So when we don't do that, again, it leads to anxiety, depression, and diminished health. We have a deep need to belong in the sense that somewhere in our life, we should have spaces and people that allow us to fully be ourselves. It doesn't have to be everywhere, but somewhere in our life, we need that. It's almost like a safety valve in a pressure cooker. When you're inundated with experiences, senses, sensory input, there has to be some place that this gets released and goes out. Okay. I think of this as the process of taking in and letting out. So everything in our human body has a process of sort of intake, integration, and letting go. We breathe in, we breathe out. We eat, we drink, we absorb nutrients, and we let out the toxins. I think of the arts as really a way to integrate our senses, everything that's sort of coming in through our senses, sight, sound, smell, taste, touch. And then we can think of the arts as a way to process, integrate, synthesize, and release. So what is the difference between sort of venting and artistic expression? So we all have our emotional states. They come, they go. We might have people that we vent to. We might vent to ourselves. We might vent in our diaries. We might go out for a run, a walk, doodle, any of those things. Now, if you take those emotions, think of it as the fuel that I shared with you before, you wrap it up in a metaphor. It could be a visual metaphor, an artistic metaphor. It could be a dance, music, drama, poetry, literary metaphor. And then you have converted this fundamental emotion into an artistic expression that connects us across humanity, across space, across time. So think about a piece of poetry written 200 years ago, and it still speaks to you. Why? Because the emotional state embedded in that artistic work is not different from what you're experiencing right now. So fundamentally, our emotional lives have not changed since our hunter-gatherer days. We are the same beings living in this frenzied modern world. So to connect with something that's 2,000 years old, few hundred years old, is actually makes perfect sense. And the reason we can do that is because it's because someone took the time and effort to wrap it in this metaphor that can transcend space and time. So is everyone ready for a brief experiential that we might do? Yes?
I think we are ready. Yes.
Okay, great. And I know, I hope, and I hope you have your smartphone on hand. I know most people have smartphones. So for now, if you have your phone on hand and if you have a phone gallery, you could do it with that, or you can just do it on your laptops. You can just open up a browser if you like. So what I'd like you to do, if you have your phone handy, is to pull up your photo gallery. Now, in that photo gallery, I want you to find two images. One in the last 6 months. Okay, so scroll through your photos that you've taken in the last 6 months. And I'm not going to ask anybody to share or anything. This is just an exercise for you to do. Go through your phone gallery and find an image that represents joy. So an image in which you felt really happy. And the second one an image in which you felt kind of maybe wistful, nostalgic, maybe a little sad, maybe even a little bittersweet. But find these two images and then kind of look at what were aspects of it that made you feel joy, that made you feel a little wistful. So let's take about a minute and find these two images. Now, if you found these images, look at what might be the difference between the two. What made one joyous? Was it the environment? Was it the people? Was it your own frame of mind that particular day and time? Or was it something else? And for the second one, similarly, what made it wistful? What made it nostalgic? Maybe a little sad, maybe a little bittersweet. Again, was it the location? Was it the people in it? Was it your own mood, your own sort of mental state? Was it a particular day of the week? Was it a particular time? And all this is really giving you information about yourself, right? It's giving you insight into who you are and what it is that makes you you. What is it that inspires you? What is it that keeps you going? And what is it that holds you back? Everybody had a chance to do this?
Yes, although someone had just written in, they'd just asked if you could repeat the task.
Oh, sure. Sure. So what I'd asked you all to do, should you have your smartphone handy, is to pull up the photo gallery and find two images. One image that is representative of a time where you felt really happy. And ideally, I want you to find this in the last 6 months. And the second is an image of a time where you felt perhaps a little sad, wistful, nostalgic, bittersweet, any of the above, sort of somewhat opposing emotions. And to reflect on what made one image happy and the other image, the memory of the other image, a little different. Yeah, helpful?
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so this is an exercise that I wanted to do as a sort of introduction to, give me a second, is this moving? Yeah, as an introduction to art therapy, because this is the fundamental idea, the idea that so much of our emotional life, our inner lives are not um, adequately captured in words, that we need nonverbal expressive options because not all our experiences are verbal. We don't interact with the world just with words. We interact with all our senses. We see things, we smell things, we taste, touch, hear. But amongst all these, the visual sense is the most dominant. So as human beings, especially as we became upright, our ability to scan the environment for threats and opportunities became incredibly heightened. So by some estimates, almost sort of 55% of our brain processing capacity is focused on visual processing. So our visual sense is highly developed, highly sort of sensitized and specialized in a way, for example, that our sense of smell is not. So a lot of what we understand and process in the world is through our visual senses. And as you can see today, right, we are doing this session on Zoom. And what are the two senses we're using? We're using sight and sound. And those are sort of dominant senses in our world right now, in our modern world. So I think of our creative capacities as engaging our self-efficacy, our agency, and our need for expression is one of our sort of fundamental needs. And that's why I wrote my book called The Expressive Instinct, to highlight this. We have a need to express ourselves. And we have a need to be seen, to be heard, because again, it reinforces and reduces our loneliness. It reminds us that someone cares to listen to us and someone cares for our story. Similarly, there's a interesting dynamic between our need for safety and our need for novelty. So when we have a sense of belonging, we feel safe. But safety can also be boring and repetitive, right? So as with a lot of our experiences, they can switch really quickly. Our brain seeks novelty because it wants to learn constantly. So novelty is exciting, but novelty can also quickly change into danger and threat. So our efforts as humans are to sort of navigate this dynamic between wanting to connect, wanting to express, wanting safety, but also having opportunities for sort of experiencing new things, learning new things that keep us vital and alive. Excuse me, I feel a sneeze coming. Okay. Right. So how does this work in art therapy? I don't know how many of you are familiar with the profession of art therapy. As I'd mentioned, it began in the mid 20th century with children with special needs and with soldiers after World War II. And the idea here is that you have a clinician, and right now as a profession, art therapy is the entry level is at the master's level. You need a master's degree and 1,000 hours of clinical experience with supervision. That makes you a credentialed art therapist. So when you go to an art therapist, you're going to a credentialed mental health professional. And what they do with you is they bring in art materials. And a question we get often is, do you have to be an artist to benefit from art therapy? Absolutely not. In fact, it's almost better that you're not, because you have fewer sort of pressures and restrictions you put on yourself around self-expression. And the work of an art therapist is to help you identify your challenges, identify and feel safe to express what is going on with you, and then identify goals for where you want to go. What the process does invariably, and this is where art therapy is a little different from music therapy and dance movement therapy and drama therapy, for example, is that you have an art product at the end, which you can look at. It gives you some distance and it gives you perspective on your experiences. Okay. So I will go now into some of the specific studies that we have looked at to look at outcomes of offering art therapy and how that impacts patients and clients. So this was a study we did in a radiation oncology unit. We offered, let me see here, this was funded by the National Endowment for the Arts as well as Drexel University, and we offered both the providers at the site, the healthcare providers, family members, as well as patients, 2 sessions. And this was based on a previous study we did with relatively healthy adults, where we found that art therapy had sort of somewhat better outcomes than doing coloring alone. And we offered everyone 2 sessions. One was a coloring session that they did by themselves, and the second was an art therapist facilitated open studio where they created something open-ended with facilitated support. We looked at measures of stress, burnout, mood, self-efficacy, that sort of self-confidence, and anxiety before and after. We also looked at cortisol levels, C-reactive protein, and IL-6 in their saliva. And this was mainly for caregivers because the patients often had dry mouth and could not give us enough saliva samples. So I'll share with you some examples of the kinds of things the participants said. So you can read this. I'll just pause for a second. Oops. This was a coloring page. So you'll see people find meaning even in things that might seem like rote tasks. So, and this is one of my favorite examples. One of the participants, he came in, his hands were shaking so much. He had brain tumor surgery, and he couldn't even like sign the consent form. That's how much his hands were shaking. And by the end of the session, they were not. And I just reflected it back to him, and he said, yeah, I know, I feel relaxed. And when that happens, my hands don't shake anymore. So when I talk about um, sessions, therapeutic sessions that are focused on psychological well-being, they are not separated from the body. Like our psychological well-being is deeply connected to our physiological functioning and well-being. Another example of a coloring page, seemingly meaningless, but profoundly meaningful for the participant. I'll let you read it. This was in an open studio session. So these are some examples of artwork, but I wanted to highlight what we found, right? So unlike with a relatively healthy population where we saw differences between coloring and open studio, in a stressed population, which is patients and caregivers going through pretty intensive treatment for difficult to treat cancers. So many of our participants were considered potentially terminal, dealing with terminal cancer. So incredibly stressful environment. And in this environment, being offered a session where they could participate in quiet, in a non-judgmental space, was found to improve their mood, was found to improve self-efficacy, reduce anxiety for both patients and caregivers. What we found, and this is what was really interesting, and to me is always a reminder for why we need to offer skills to children and not cut art education from schools, is that those who came with some prior experience in the arts tended to have better outcomes, which means that they could tap into that expressive capacity in a way that was meaningful and helpful to them. So, if you imagine yourself it's very hard to do something new or learn something new when you're stressed. So to have these tools, to have expressive tools somewhere in your experience is tremendously helpful. It's almost like a preventive health intervention. All right, I'll show you another example of a study we did on art making and reward perception. So I was really curious, what is it? Is there something that is activated when we engage in different types of visual self-expression? So we had a study, we used a technology called functional near-infrared spectroscopy, and then which basically tracks blood flow as measured through the skin, and blood flow primarily in the prefrontal cortex, because that is where your face is your head is not covered by hair, so you can actually sort of measure effectively. So we wanted to see if there's something about different artistic practices that result in different levels of activation. And at this point, nothing much had been done. So we were sort of kind of exploring this in a truly, I would say, discovery type format. So these are three examples of what one participant did. So that's what they did for coloring, that's what they did for doodling, and what the third image is what they did for free drawing. And my assumption was that the free drawing would possibly be like the most rewarding because it has fewest constraints. But really what we found was that all three conditions activated the reward pathway as measured from the prefrontal cortex, the medial prefrontal cortex, sort of the center of the forehead. And of the three, doodling was the one that activated the reward pathway the most. So I think about this a lot in terms of why that might be. And one of the ways we speculated is that doodling is a form of expression that is somewhat democratic, right? We don't really judge doodles like, oh, that's a good doodle, that's a bad doodle. Everyone has their signature doodle style, and that's okay. And that's our sort of coping during boring conference calls, perhaps. And there's a lot of research showing that when you doodle, you actually remember more and you focus more. So anytime someone sort of challenges you on doodling, make sure you remember this. It's good for you. All right. What I showed you so far are some of our studies using physical media, natural media. But there's increasing presence of virtual reality, and we were curious about what happens when we create in virtual reality. So one of the sort of unique aspects of VR is that you're not limited by, a desk, a table, or this sort of limited space in front of you. You can really create all around. You can create in 3 dimensions, you can create in space, and you can also sort of transcend the natural laws of physics. You can go through things, you can go in and out of things in ways that we can't kind of do in the physical world. So there's a lot of creative potential, but there's also sort of limitations, right? Like there's nothing tangible, it's all digital. That's the sort of frustration of digital, both the opportunities as well as the sort of lack of something tangible and concrete, if that's important to you. So we took the FNIR study that I'd shown you previously. We put on our headsets and we said, okay, let's have people do 2 different conditions. One is a rote condition where they trace a drawing, and the second is a creative condition where they do a creative scribble, a variation of a scribble drawing, which is something we use in art therapy quite a bit. And these are sort of some examples of the kinds of things folks made. So what did we find? And this goes back to the title of our talk and my my sort of soapbox, is that we are fundamentally creative. And this was really, really exciting for us to find, because what this demonstrated was it's natural for us to be creative. Our brain actually makes and uses less effort when we are engaging in an imaginative and creative task. And these are measures of like prefrontal cortical activity, that to do a tracing task, because it's kind of repetitive and boring, takes more mental effort. There's value to that. I think there's, especially if you are easily distracted, attention is a challenge. Yes, this is an indication that perhaps more focused tasks are helpful to you. However, naturally, our brain is more relaxed and more sort of in its natural state when we are engaging in creative activities. All right, so a few more examples. Are we okay with time, Margaret and Dorian?
Yes, sure. I'll have plenty. Yeah,
Okay.
problem.
Okay. I'll show you a few more examples because our approach to research in my lab and in my work is sort of across the lifespan. We look at a range of conditions, both related to mood, related to life circumstance, medical illnesses, post-traumatic stress, um, as well as sort of different needs at different developmental stages, starting all the way with children. I didn't share much of that today, to midlife, to older life, and end of life. So we have studies sort of that span the lifespan, which is really my interest and something that you know uh, contributes to lifelong learning. So for the last almost 10 years, we've been working with military service members with post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury, with TBI being the sort of signature injury of recent wars. And we have been working with the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, as well as a few other VAs around the impact of art therapy. So this is a study that we did around masks that were made by service members as part of their art therapy experience and intervention. And what we found was that those who represented psychological injury invariably had higher PTSD scores. So there's something about risk and resilience embedded in the kind of visual images we make. And this was one of the first studies to really demonstrate that our mental states and our sort of risk and resilience levels are embedded in the kinds of images that we make. Similarly, and particularly for the military, a sense of identification with the military unit, that sense of belonging that I'd spoken about, is a significant protective factor. So those who identified strongly with their military branch or unit tended to have lower PTSD scores and lower depression scores. Um, Overall, and those who were able to represent ideas coherently in metaphors, again, showed lower anxiety levels. They were really able to capture and hold the experience in a more meaningful way. And that makes perfect sense, right? Again, going back to that image that I showed you, there, the ability to take our emotions, take our inner states, and manifest them in a artistic metaphor is a level of functioning that indicates health, that indicates the ability to communicate in a coherent and meaningful way. These are some more examples of studies that we did with the military. This is paintings that were done towards the end of the treatment. Again, taking risks in the art rather than in life itself, taking our challenges and our need to communicate and channeling them into a creative, expressive form rather than acting it out in life. That is sort of the ideal outcome we want to see in art therapy. All right. I'll share with you, I think this is the last study I'm going to share with you today. This is a recent publication that we had come out where we're focusing on postmenopausal women's health. So unfortunately, in society, a third of women's lives tend to be sort of dismissed, made, there's jokes about being older, and in a society that really values youth. And unfortunately, there's a lot of sort of misperception and stigma around pretty much what would be a third of most women's lives. And what we wanted to bring to this life stage where there are cardiovascular risks, nutrition risks, mental health risks, and weight and obesity related risks, we wanted to bring an integrative intervention that includes art therapy, dance movement therapy, and nutrition education to support women in this stage of life. So this is an intervention that we did. You can see examples of how we approached it around, and not once did we mention weight gain or weight loss. right? We always referred to a nurturing approach to the body, a nurturing approach to the self. Weight gain or loss is completely incidental and irrelevant in a way. So we sort of talked about quality of life, emotion regulation, body image, sort of recognizing our own cues, like I did with that phone photo gallery experiential, really kind of using our expressive capacities to better understand ourselves. Okay. And believe it or not, this is what we found. Tremendous change in quality of life outcomes, less so in the actual BMI, which is a controversial measure anyway, but changes in blood pressure and significant reduction in stress. So I'm just showing you the findings from 3 participants. This was sort of a initial pilot case example study. Changes in affect or mood. And changes in and reduced body image dysphoria, which means, and what this means really is that an increasing acceptance and comfort with the body. All right. So what does all this mean? And what does this mean for the future? So as I mentioned to you, our brains, our bodies, our emotions are really thousands of years old. We are in a faster paced society, but our need for expression is unchanged. Our need for someone to hear our experiences is unchanged. Our drive for creativity, problem solving, and seeing joy, seeing sort of joy and beauty, all that is unchanged. What will change and has changed over thousands of years is how we express ourselves. We might not be chiseling with stone anymore. We might not be painting on rock walls anymore, but we are painting, we are sculpting, we are creating, and we're doing a lot of these things digitally now. So you are capturing things on your phone. You might be capturing things on social media. Again, an example of, almost 50 years ago when my father wrote a book, he hand wrote it, and my mother made a final copy, and she hand wrote it too. But in my case, I wrote it almost fully online. I did not, I did not use paper and pencil. The how changed, the what did not. And as you know, there's increasing sort of opportunities through AI. And I'm not against, or I'm not like paranoid about AI and artistic expression at all. I think it's another tool that we have with its flaws, with its limitations, but also with its opportunities. I see some amazing things done by my colleagues, my friends, where they have taken this as a tool, as an expressive tool, to tremendous effect around exploration, and joy, right? This is really the gist of what I'm trying to say today, which is that we are inherently creative. We express ourselves in many different ways. Those ways might change. Who views our work might change. 50 years ago, we could not have done this lecture this way, right? I would have to be in a physical room with physical people. But now we are able to do much more than that. All right. Wouldn't have been able to do any of this without all my colleagues and collaborators and students and postdocs, and big thanks to all of them. Recognizing all our funders again, we are able to do this because people are increasingly recognizing the value of the arts in our lives. And finally, this is, the book that I wrote last year that encompasses a lot of these ideas. And I think that is it for today.
Thank you. Girija Kaimal, wonderful talk, and we have quite a few questions here. So,
Okay.
and we have some claps and perhaps some even hand raised.
Thanks.
So,
How should we do this? Should we stop share and just go to?
I'll just read you a question and
Okay.
then you can answer it, and then I'll let the hand
Okay.
raised person go after that. So, um, oh, there are quite a few questions here. So, um, Delphina says, as you mentioned, humans have predictive brains, enabling us to have imagination. It was also mentioned how this trait is unique to humans. How do we measure this? After all, we're genetically similar to other mammals, 98% with chimps. We're also somewhat behaviorally similar to them. Psychological issues such as loneliness impact our physical health. Isn't this more of an instinctive reaction? Oh, I see there's more questions. So anyway, I'll leave you that first one.
Okay. Is that one question or two?
Well, I think there's two there.
Okay.
Yeah. There's
Okay.
probably like five actually, but I'm I'm gonna cut off that first one there.
Yeah. So I think this is, I I, I think people question that. There is some evidence around what we think about in terms of creativity. So creativity is creating something new that is not just new for the sake of new, but that sort of expands our worldview, expands our the way we see the world. And that kind of innovation and problem solving really only exists right now in human beings. Yes, animals adapt, animals problem solve, but the way we define creativity as innovation, um, that is primarily, as far as I see, a capacity of the human brain. There have been studies done on this in terms of, and there are people who'll argue, well, the Neanderthals also had creative capacity. And if you look back at the earliest cave paintings, if you want to consider that as a measure of human expressive capacity, there's no need to make cave paintings, really, right? It's an expressive extension of perhaps a need to document or celebrate a success, or I don't know, deal with the long days and nights of boredom sitting in a cave. I don't know. But if you think of those as examples and evidence, that would be humans.
Okay, thank you. We're gonna ask Ash to unmute, and Ash has their hand up.
Thank you very much for your informative, helpful, and inspiring talk. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you.
My question is regarding, you mentioned about in your studies biomarkers like cortisol and C-reactive proteins, etc. I was wondering, various studies, especially by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, who was practicing at Mass General Hospital and researching there, he did studies on yoga, Tai Chi, EMDR, and more importantly, neurofeedback, where his studies showed that during the functional magnetic resonance imaging, there was vast improvement in the activation of the prefrontal cortex and a reduced activity in the area of the limbic system, the amygdala.
Yep.
I was wondering, any studies in art therapy using the functional MRI showing that kind of results?
Yeah, so we're actually doing one right now in collaboration with the University of Florida. There aren't a lot. I think some of the challenges of MRI are that you are physically sort of lying down. It's really hard to do drawings when you're lying down in this tube, which is why we have done studies using FNIRS, which allows for more naturalistic tracking of brain activity. There is some there are a couple of correlational studies that have looked at artwork made by service members with PTSD and TBI, and improved thalamic connectivity for those who represented certain types of images. This was done by my colleagues at Walter Reed, including my colleague Melissa Walker and her collaborators. So yes, it's not. There isn't much, but I'm definitely hoping for more in the future. Thank you for sort of bringing that up.
Thank you, Ash. Thanks for that question. And I have a question, sort of nuts and bolts question from David. Two questions. One is, what's the role of an art therapist in the session? Do they make art with the client? How does it work? And the second question is, how long does it take for art therapy to work?
Great questions. So the art therapist is in the room as your facilitator, as your guide in the session. So typically, an art therapist will not be making art with the patient. However, if they are showing them how to work with a particular media, or they are working on a joint piece, because that's part of the treatment goals, where you want to sort of improve interpersonal attunement, connection, then they would engage in the artwork. But the session really is around helping the patient and the client express themselves in ways that are meaningful to them. So sometimes I have engaged in art making when I'm working with young clients as a way to sort of teach social skills, or as a way to engage in interpersonal, or model how we might take turns, how we might work together. But again, anytime an art therapist does something in a session, it's intentional and for meeting the goals of the patient. And what is the second question? How long? Okay. Again,
How long does it take?
again, it varies by condition and need. Sometimes it can take years to see significant change, especially for someone who is struggling with deep and profound psychological challenges. Sometimes it might be just a session. So the studies that I showed you where we saw outcomes within a single session, it really varies and depends.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, David, for the question. We have Marty with hand up. I'm going to ask Marty to unmute.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Oh, my question is, in what ways does the use of virtual reality for artistic expression challenge traditional notions of creativity and perception, and how might these insights inform future research and therapeutic applications?
What a great question. So I will say, because it's a new media, there are some fascinating sort of outcomes. So for example, people have a lot of fear, stigma, associations with traditional art media. They're like, oh, I'm not a painter, I'm not an artist. And they are intimidated perhaps, or have associations because, we all know of painting or drawing or things like that. But in VR, there are no such associations because it's a new media. It's a new expressive tool. So there's fewer stigmas. In fact, there's also like a sort of fascination and coolness factor to it, where if you are kind of tech inclined, or you're a younger person, and especially with men, I'll tell you, like men are more inclined to come participate in our VR studies than some of our other studies. Also in VR, because it's new, there's a lot of sort of joy and excitement in the novelty. So just experiencing, people have sort of come out of our studies being like, wow, that was so much fun. Like they feel a sense of accomplishment, like they discovered something new, which is again, very different from some of the other sessions with traditional art media.
Okay. Thank you for that answer and for the question, Marty. Okay, we have many, many good questions here. Let's see. Tracy says, what's your take on radical positivity and gratitude journaling? Does it help in the face of adversity, or does it just mask real emotions?
I'm not entirely sure what radical positivity is. I hope it's not like toxic positivity, of which I am not a fan. Um, I think gratitude, there's a lot of studies that indicate that gratitude actually is a very helpful exercise. And I would agree over there. I think no matter what gratitude does is really shifts our mindset, because again, our brains are wired to notice only the negative, only the challenges. Why? Because it's kind of optimizing for your survival and making sure you recognize all the threats in the environment so that you are alert to any of them potentially harming you. So because we are wired for this negativity, to recognize that which is not negative and that for which we might be grateful is a very helpful exercise. So what gratitude does is really remind us of the things that are going well, of the things that we might appreciate, and recognize that not everything is awful in what is going on in our lives.
Thank you. Very nice.
And I'm going to go check out what radical positivity is. So thank you.
Yeah, I think we all need to find out what that is.
Yeah.
Caleb is asking, can you provide one example of how art therapy and yourself have helped out a veteran? Would love to hear about it.
Yeah. I think what art therapy does is invariably provide an integration. So for service members and for veterans, it becomes a space where you see all the things that you're struggling with integrated into one image or one piece of art. So we recently completed a study with Gulf War veterans who tend to be like a neglected population in the VA. And what the sort of expressive sessions did was to bring together and highlight all their experiences in one image. And what that does really is integrate the negatives with the positives and sort of really help see the complexity of the human experience, that all our emotions, all the range of things we experience make us who we are. And to recognize that, to be aware of it, and to also recognize that, emotional states, feeling states come and go, things change all the time. And to sort of be able to literally have some physical distance from what feels like a very internal, disturbing experience. When you get it out on paper, you have some physical distance with it. And that helps with like perspective taking and having some distance from what feels like an overly consuming and overwhelming inner experience. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. Yes. Cookie has a question. You mentioned body image. Have there been studies with people with anorexia or body dysmorphia of other type? It seems people with this condition have a visual distortion when they see themselves in the mirror. Would be interesting to see what kind of art they produce, especially if asked to reproduce something realistically.
Yeah. There are a lot of studies. Well, I wouldn't say a lot. There are a lot of art therapists working with individuals with eating disorders, eating related challenges. There's a fascinating parallel between art materials and media and food. So in the case of eating related challenges, the art media become a way to process and to sort of engage our senses in a different way, and to learn to manage some of the um, sort of either overwhelming or restrictive aspects of eating, and then channeling that, processing that um, through the artistic expression. So yes, there's some amount of work on that.
Thank you. Okay. Devin asks, when you create art with an art therapist with a positive emotional connotation and feeling, can looking at the art you made and remembering back to the time you made it and the meanings you put into it have the same positive effects of when you actually created the art? Are there any limitations to this effect?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, yes, right. So when you create something, it becomes a reflection of that moment in time. Now, depending on how that moment in time was for you, you may or may not remember it positively, right? Um, to me, it's always telling when someone creates something and they take it home with them versus leaving it in the session. So if it was personally meaningful for you in the moment, you learned something new, you gained a new insight, you felt a sense of accomplishment, all those things will be reinforced when you see that image again. I've had people like participate in workshops and do really simple things. And then they'll tell me years later, you know what, I still have it hanging in my bedroom or my office. Um, that's one example. In many cases, um, the artwork ends up, even when someone leaves it behind, it might be a meaningful and intentional act because they want to leave it behind for those who come after. So for patients in a medical setting, perhaps, seeing the artwork of former patients is a reminder that others have been here too. It's a sort of conceptual belonging. Others have been here too. They've navigated this too. And I am not alone in this experience. So again, as with everything, I think there's a lot of individual variation, and the meaning that you derived in a session is absolutely reinforced by looking at it later.
Thank you. We don't have any hands raised, but we have a lot of other questions here. Abby's asking, how has art therapy changed throughout the years? Has new scientific knowledge about the human body and the brain caused changes in how art therapy is given?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. There, so the clinical practice has tended to sort of be more more evolved in a way than the research. So, art therapy had its origins in psychodynamic theory. So there, for the longest time, there were a lot of case examples, case studies. It's only recently, with some amount of, increased funding, that we are able to do larger studies. We are able to do more generalizable studies than have been done in the past. I think there's increasing recognition of the many different ways you can think of art media. The other thing that I'm really excited about is when art therapy began, it was, and it still is to some extent, a very Eurocentric profession, began in Europe and America. But there is a lot of interest around the world. And it makes perfect sense to me. If you think about the arts in different communities, it exists all over the world, right? The idea that the arts are important to us is something that every civilization and every community got. And there's nothing new here. Like, this is a new profession, but the role of the arts to promote health and well-being and connection is, again, as old as the hills. So that I'm really excited about, increasing recognition of indigenous and traditional arts practices. I didn't share that today, but that's a big thrust of our research going forward too. Use of new media and materials, recognizing the needs of different populations, not just psychiatric populations, but recognizing the need and impact of everyday stress, chronic stress. All those things are things I'm very excited about.
Thank you. Here's another nuts and bolts question from Satvik. Which part of the human brain is connected to humans' creativity, and how does it go through the process?
All of it. I'm not a neuroscientist. I will put that disclaimer out there. But the creative act, the creative process is like a workout for the brain. It uses everything, your senses, your memories, your decision making, your executive control, the meanings you associate with it, the joy or frustration of the process. all of it. It's like, it's one of the few things that really engages every part of your brain. And there's no one part. It's really like an integration of so many different aspects: emotion, cognition, motor control, um, awareness, perception, all of it.
Okay, I have a question from Amelie. I'm going to piggyback on from with Jen's here. Amelie says, would the effects and findings mentioned about art therapy's impact on the patient also apply to the same extent if you were just to color or spend time with art yourself in a non-professional setting and without the presence of a professional to guide you, or would it be less effective? And then I'm piggybacking this on question saying the very divisive and anxiety-provoking times we live in. For those of us who doom scroll, what art exercises might you recommend?
I doom scroll too, so let's
Yeah.
normalize that.
Self-help people here.
So my analogy for this is the home improvement analogy, which is that when you have like a fused light bulb in the house, most of us can replace that light bulb, and we fix the light. Most of us, if we see peeling paint, we can get fresh paint and we can fix that. However, if you have a problem in the electrical system, if you have a problem in your plumbing system, you're better off getting a professional, because if you don't know what you're doing, you're actually going to do more harm than good. So I think of it in the same way for artistic practices by yourself versus when you need mental health support from a professional. And I think of artistic practice every day as a preventive health measure. I think sort of engaging our creative and expressive capacities is as important as diet and exercise. So I think of, diet and exercise for the body, and creative activities and expression for the soul and for the mind. We need all of these. And if you have a creative practice you enjoy, by all means, do it as much and as often as you want and can. It is a way to mitigate and manage stress, and it's a way for you to sort of take charge of your life, and it'll serve you well. So if there's something you haven't been doing for a long time that gave you joy, go ahead and pick that up. As for doom scrolling, I think if you can, make sure you have things you can do with your hands that are not scrolling. So it could even be like cooking, it could be gardening, it could be any kind of hobby that you do, anything that gets you to not consume but create. So if you feel that you're constantly just consuming, which is what doom scrolling is, that's going to feel really unfulfilling after a while. Of course, like I enjoy a meme and a reel and a video as much as the next person. But beyond a point, when you're just a consumer, that's not your natural state. So ideally, think on what are things that you like to do with your hands and make sure you do them every day.
It's a very interesting response. I will take that to heart.
Yeah.
Ashmita has a question. Is art therapy used in restorative practices within the criminal justice system? What differences do you see within this space?
Absolutely. So you should look up the work of my colleague, Dr. Dave Gasak, who's done extensive work with the prison systems in Florida, particularly with incarcerated individuals. This ends up, our therapy ends up being a way to, one, navigate things like stigma, um, self-perceptions, navigating acts, behaviors of of the past. It's a way to process a lot of challenges. It's a difficult population in many ways, and but also a population that would benefit significantly from being humanized. And what do the arts do? They recognize the individuality and humanity in each of us. And um, great question. And a population that often is sort of invisible, but very much could benefit from creative, expressive opportunities.
Thank you. I'm checking how you're doing. We've got a lot of questions, so
Oh, really? I'm okay. We can keep going.
Okay. We have a question here from Tiffany who says, well, actually it's two. How might encouraging imagination and creative expression with art contribute to resilience and coping strategies, particularly in individuals facing mental health challenges such as traumatic brain injury, PTSD, and chronic stress? And also, are there specific neurological mechanisms or pathways that your research has identified as being influenced by engaging with art?
Yeah. So trauma in general is something that art therapy, there's research on it. It's something that a lot of art therapists work with and have experience with. And particularly with trauma, I think the value of art therapy is in allowing for expression and allowing for saying the unsayable. So, as I had mentioned before, our experiences are not just with words. So, most recently, a few years ago, there was a study that showed that I think it was a meta-analysis that looked at cognitive behavioral therapy for post-traumatic stress, and that there were not substantive benefits, and that there was really a need for non-traditional therapies, things that were not just talk therapies for patients who are struggling with post-traumatic stress. So there is also evidence that when you go through traumatic experiences, your speech centers are affected, especially profound traumatic experiences. So if your speech centers are affected, you do need non-verbal ways of expression to navigate trauma and to process the experience enough that you're able to manage the symptoms. So that is where art therapy really helps to be able to offer channels of communication beyond words alone, which is what traditional talk therapies are about.
Okay, thank you. I have a question from Sabrina. How do you address any possible emotional reactions or challenges that may arise during the therapy session?
That's part of the training of an art therapist is to hold difficult emotions and help patients and clients normalize, accept, and manage difficult emotions. And that's really important for sort of self-regulation, adjustment, adaptation, and navigating challenges that all of us will constantly face throughout life. So to be able to name it, recognize it, and manage it is the work of therapy.
Okay, Lucas asks, what you said about metaphor really struck me, that clients who could express ideas in metaphors had healthier outcomes and less stress. Could you expand on that? And if creating new metaphors doesn't come easily to someone, what can they do to get better at it?
Yeah. I think what metaphors indicate is that the individual is able to sort of hold an idea in complex ways. So a metaphor is something, but not directly representing the other thing, right? So it's holding an idea, but in a different way. It signals cognitive capacity, it signals the ability to think in abstract ways. All those are sort of strengths, right? Some ways to deepen the ability to abstract and to think in metaphors is to sort of be more attentive and to notice things around you. So as I had mentioned before, like so much of, there's so many metaphors in nature constantly. So look around you, look around and see what, firstly, see and hear things around you, and do they capture the idea that you want to represent, the cycles of life, the seasons of life, the way animals and plants adapt to different settings or not. All those are metaphors around us constantly.
Okay, thank you. Seth wants to know, have there been any long-term studies on the impact of art therapy on specific diseases? And if so, what diseases is it most effective for, and what's the success rate, if you know?
Yeah, so we don't have, as I had mentioned, sort of a lot of research is newer in art therapy. There's work on anxiety, there's work on depression, which have shown significant positive outcomes. There's more research on military populations now, medical art therapy, a lot, and now more so also with an aging population with older adults. I don't have sort of ready stats for you because a lot of this is still emergent. But most of the work is around mood disorders, military populations, trauma populations, and medical settings to date.
Okay, thank you. Kelly asks, how does the concept of neuroplasticity intertwine with the adaptive response theory? What are the existing distinctions between the two?
Oh, I did not get to speak about neuroplasticity. Thank you for bringing that up. So I think of neuroplasticity as representing the idea of hope. Right? To me, neuroplasticity is a reminder that there is always hope, there is always potential for change, for learning, for adaptation. We are wired to constantly adapt. Our bodies, as you know, our skin, like our bodies kind of replenish themselves every 7 years. Your physical body is not the same that you were 7 years ago. So we are constantly changing. We are constantly adapting, like it or not. And that is a core underlying idea of the adaptive response theory, is that we are adapting constantly. Of course, it's going to be a little bit harder when we are older because our brains, not that we're not creating new neurons, that has definitely been established, but that our ability to change significantly is somewhat reduced compared to, say, a newborn or a young child whose neural systems, neural networks are a lot more adaptive to change, a lot more receptive to change. That said, there's always hope. There's always potential for change, for growth. And it's not just platitudes. I really believe it. We can really change ourselves by the way we think, by the way we eat, by the way we move. Our bodies can change at any age.
Great, thank you. Kimberly asks, earlier it was mentioned that your vision is about 55% of your nonverbal communication. I wanted to ask if your experiences affect or change which senses become more heightened.
Oh, I just wanted to clarify that the 55% was referring more to our brain processing. So the brain uses like majority of its resources to for the visual system. That's really where I was getting at. And what is the second part of that question?
Wanted to ask if your experiences affect or change which senses become more heightened?
For sure. So, we start out with most of us, if you have your senses, all the senses functioning, most of us will lean more towards the visual or the oral, the sound system. I know of, colleagues and people where if one sensory system is impacted, perhaps going blind or losing sight or losing hearing, that the other senses become more heightened. For sure. It really varies by person.
Mish wants to know, how did you make those images on the ginkgo leaves? They're beautiful.
Oh, thank you. I love the shape of the ginkgo leaves too. Ginkgo leaves are a whole other metaphor all on their own. Very resilient plants, very adaptable, can grow anywhere, haven't changed in thousands of years, and medicinal as well. So what I did was I pressed them and then I painted on them and I finished them with resin. So that is what gives it a sort of gloss.
They're beautiful. Yeah. Wonderful. How are you doing with you holding up for
I
time?
might be reaching the end of my voice.
Okay.
I've been battling a
more?
bit of a throat thing, so maybe
Okay,
one or
one
two
more, or-
questions. Yeah.
Okay, well, Hugo has a question. Thanks for this great presentation. What are your thoughts on psychedelic assisted therapy combined with art therapy?
Yeah. I would say, yeah, let's do it. I'm not aware of it, but yeah.
And then Tamid has a question. Are there specific artistic modalities or techniques that have shown particular effectiveness in facilitating therapeutic outcomes?
I think this is so subjective by person and context. Sometimes I've seen tremendous outcomes for someone working with just a paper and a pencil. At other times, I've seen tremendous outcomes on someone working with clay. So in general, materials and media that allow for more variation and adaptability tend to be more emotionally evocative, is the sort of common understanding of materials and media. But it really depends on the context, the individual, and the outcomes can be tremendous no matter what the media.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the fantastic Q&A and fascinating talk. What a great subject. And obviously there are a million more questions that could and are ready to be following you here, but we'll give you a chance to rest your voice.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so
Really
much,
great
Girija
questions.
Kaimal. What fantastic. And once again, thank you to the Dana Foundation for their partnership and support. And also, let's remind people about The Expressive Instinct, your book. Fantastic book, really fascinating. I have it and have read it. It's great. And we'll link where you can buy it, or you can find it where you find books.
Yeah, this is a fantastic talk, and thank you for answering so many questions and so many great questions. Thanks to the audience for that. We're just gonna play you out with a little expressive music in honor of your book.
Great. Thank you so much.
Okay. Good night, everybody.